This is This Week in Science and Education, episode 24, recorded February 1st, 2011, Restoring Natural Environments.
That's you.
This is This Week in Science and Education, the show that talks all about health research and science and discovery, and helping teachers and students take that information and apply it to the curriculum and bring it into the classroom. On today's show, Franco Mariotti from the Science North facility in Sudbury, Ontario. All that today and more on This Week in Science and Education. Science and Education is brought to you by Mueller Systems. If you have some pictures and some data that you don't want to disappear in the catastrophe, check out muellerdata.com/vrod. It's time for This Week in Science and Education. Hi everybody, this is your host Kevin Cougler. We're very pleased today to welcome Franco Mariotti from Science North in Sudbury, Ontario. But before we meet our guest, as always, let's turn to the fellows that really make this show what it is. And, actually, they're not with us, so we'll introduce Colin and Thomas instead.
Awesome.
Hey guys,
we
Colin
appreciate
Jagoe,
that.
Refinery.
How you doing
How's
today?
it going, Colin? Good.
Just great. How are you guys?
Good stuff. Dr. Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, how are you?
Super. Thanks for bringing our guest by today. And Mr. Mariotti, it's very excellent that you were able to join us today. I'm looking forward to hearing all about what your work entails at Science North, and in particular the Junction Creek project. I think that looked really fascinating. I'm going to read this short bio that talks a little bit about you and what you do, and then I'll ask you to add to that and tell us a little bit about your research and your work at Science North. Franco is a staff scientist, biologist at Science North, which is located in Sudbury, Ontario. He's been a science and natural history educator for over 35 years and has been involved in many advisory committees dealing with natural resource issues, and as well as being involved with several community groups, all dealing with the environment. Very pleased to welcome him here today. Hi, Franco. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
A real pleasure. Yeah, thanks, Franco.
Tell us a little bit about who you are and your work at Science North, how you came to be there, and a little bit about the Junction Creek project.
My position at Science North is staff scientist, but you should be aware that we don't do any research at Science North. We are science educators. And as a biologist, my specialty is natural history. So when I say educators, you think of standing in front of a group of kids and chatting away. We actually do some of that, but we also, personally now, being there for 29 years, I develop exhibits. There's a small team of us. We do traveling exhibits, and most of them are related to natural history. For example, the one we're working on now deals with endangered species from across the world. And not only do we turn those stories into hands-on exhibits, we incorporate touch screens, so it's a very hands-on, self-learning experience when people go through our exhibits. We also at the Science Center.
And let me just interject. I think from the three of us having been to Science North recently, we know that's the case. Right? It was very
absolutely.
much a hands-on,
Absolutely.
hands-on tour.
Yeah, for sure.
So then when you were at Science North, you realize also that it's very unusual for a science center to have a whole series of live animals, and that's what we have at Science North, and they've been there ever since we opened 26 years ago. And that was really one of my favorite things. I helped begin that area, and the whole notion, which really reflects the mission of Science North, is to open up people's eyes to what is really in their own backyard. So, sometimes when you go to a zoo, that's about the only place where you're going to see an elephant unless you go to Africa. But here at Science North, you walk out of the Science Center and you can encounter these animals literally in your own backyard or when you go camping. And the idea is once they've met one of our blue coats, which I don from time to time, once you've met one of our blue coats, you'll never be able to see these animals quite the same way again. And in fact, in a very positive light. So that's at the heart of what we do. Now, our topic today, though, is Junction Creek, and that's not part of my work at Science North. It reflects my interest, certainly, but I volunteer, like many people in the community, as part of this citizens committee that is trying to restore life in this creek that runs right through the heart of the city, which is about 18 kilometers.
So, Franco, how long have you been doing how long has the Junction Creek project been around, and how long have you been involved?
I've been involved right from its initiation 11 years ago.
Okay.
It began as an Earth Day event, and some of you may realize that when you celebrate Earth Day, it seems, okay, you celebrate for the day and then next day you forget about it. We took this very seriously, and we began it as an Earth Day project, but we said, why do we stop? Let's continue it. Sudbury, and listeners and viewers may know that Sudbury has this fantastic regreening history. If you visited Sudbury 25 years ago, it looked like the moonscape. You come through now, there's a young forest all around Sudbury. We took that as an example that if that dream could become a reality, which it has, surely we could restore life to this little creek that goes through the city.
So tell us about Junction Creek. Why this creek? What's the history of the creek? What was it when you started, and where's the creek now 11 years later?
Well,
the creek's in the same spot as it was before, Thomas.
We moved it a little to the left.
Well, what's neat about it, if you enter the city, you're going to come across Junction Creek. It literally bisects the city from northeast to southwest for 18 kilometers, right through the heart of the city. At one time, it used to be bordered by the largest red and white pine forest in North America. 125 years ago, logging came through, removed that red and white pine, primarily went to the northern U.S. cities to rebuild cities like Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire. And then shortly after logging, the clear cutting took place here, mining was discovered, copper and nickel. And of course, you can all imagine what the result of that was. The early mining methods was totally destructive, no environmentally friendly to it whatsoever. And it created this moonscape. The soil that was here holding those red and white pines has eroded. The neat thing is I could take you to one of these old stumps. And if you look very carefully, two things stand out. You can see all the roots, including the stump where it was hand cut, so about 1.5 meters off the ground. And if you look closely at some of these stumps, there's a little white line about 1 meter off the ground. That white line is the soil line. So a meter of soil has eroded from the Sudbury landscape. Now,
It's amazing.
that is coming back, slowly but surely. There are trees that have been planted 30 years ago where you could find birds' nests, and you could actually walk in the shade of these trees, which is unheard of as a child. The Sudbury I grew up in was a moonscape, literally. So the example is they did that, made that into a reality, but people forgot about the creek because the nickname was Junk Creek. And the interesting thing is, the reason why Sudbury is here is because of the creek. When Canada was joined from east to west by the CPR, these steam engines would stop at this creek. There was no village or city here yet. And the steam engines, as you may know, need water. So they used to take in water for the steam engines. They did this so often at this particular place that they put a junction and named it the Sudbury Junction. Not anything in particular initially, but the creek behind it, where they took the water from, became known as Junction Creek. Over the past century, garbage and pollution literally destroyed the creek, other than the water was there. But the water was polluted, the brook trout that used to be there was gone. And so our challenge began 11 years ago on Earth Day, saying, if we could regreen Sudbury, surely we could reintroduce life back to the creek. And it's been amazing, actually, some of the changes that have occurred in these past 11 years.
So how big is the creek? It's 18 kilometers?
18 kilometers long. You can walk across it. It's only, it varies from a few meters to, at most, 8-10 meters across. Most places, it's up to your knees.
Okay.
But there's a few potholes where that might be just slightly over your head.
Yeah. So what does recovering Junction Creek mean? Is the water quality better? The land around it? The substrate? What are you doing?
All of those.
Okay.
Primarily, we want to improve the water quality so you can see the kind of life that's supposed to be there. The aquatic invertebrates, which once installed will lead to the small fish, which will lead to the big fish like brook trout. And once you see those, you start seeing the turtles and amphibians. And some of the problem is that some of the vegetation along the shoreline has been destroyed because of the industrial background. So we are also replanting, restoring vegetation to create shade. Brook trout like cold water streams. Because some of the streams are exposed to the sun, the water temperature is too high. So even though the water quality may be suitable, it's too warm for the brook trout to come down into. So we're trying to restore the shade in those places.
Where's the water coming from?
The water, it's almost ahead of the watershed. We've traced it back to a spring just at the northeast edge of the city. And so the watershed actually begins there, flows southwest into what we call the Vermilion River, into what goes the Spanish River, into the North Channel of Lake Huron.
Yeah.
So it has this long. The interesting thing was that a few years ago I was on a recovery of a watershed at the entrance of the Spanish River, which, as a bird flies, is perhaps 100 kilometers away. One of the last challenges to clean that mouth of the river, of the Spanish, was to stop the pollution or reduce the pollution here in Sudbury, because all those heavy metals flowed downstream from this little stream into that mouth. So the sediments settled at the mouth of the Spanish River.
Wow.
And so it's amazing the long range impacts, you know.
You talked about the soil that's missing here, and you and I were talking. Franco, as an aside, is also my source of firewood. So we trade. I split logs on his property, and he gives me firewood, and points out that my chainsaw is dull. One of the conversations that you and I had about that erosion, you were talking about where the soil is gone. So tell us where. You don't lose a meter of soil.
Yeah.
Has it made it all the way to the North Channel? Where is that?
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah,
Sorry,
really
Colin, that's
Question.
your
No, that's fine. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I was going to ask that. Okay, where is that stuff? Is it all sort of still in the sediments, or is it completely gone?
Let me answer first that I remember, you know, as a young teenager walking in between some of these stumps that I've described to you, and somebody saying, you know, there used to be a forest here.
Right.
And when you're looking at black rocks and the occasional stump, that is really hard to imagine. The soil is really dirt that if you pick it up in your hands, sometimes smelled like sulfur. There's nothing growing on it. You don't smell the bacteria, you don't smell the mushroom, the fungi, nothing. So it was very difficult for me, for a teenager, to think of anything as being alive in and around Sudbury. I always thought it looked like that, but of course it hadn't. That soil, as I eventually discovered when I came to Laurentian to do my biology degree, I used to think it was wind blown away. You know, the wind would pick up in the summer.
Right.
No. Most of that was washed. Every time it rained, most of that was washed into Junction Creek and flowed southwest. Some of it made its way to the Spanish River carrying those heavy metals. But the neat thing is 18 kilometers downstream, just at the edge of southwest edge of the city, there's a lake called Kelly Lake where Junction Creek flows into.
Okay.
There's an aerial photograph taken in 1930 at the mouth of Junction Creek into this lake. And you could see, you know, the Junction Creek and the bay. 60 years later, that same spot was photographed again by another airplane. 60 years later, so this was 1990 now. And the mouth of the creek was extended 2,000 feet out into Kelly Lake.
Wow.
By the sediments continuously being washed down from the surrounding landscape. That's where most of that soil went.
So it just keeps building up as
it just keeps building up.
Yeah, so the
filling
channel
in.
keeps going out, filling in. Amazing.
Yeah, but that was, what were the dates on that?
60 years apart.
But the actual dates.
1930
Yeah.
to 1990.
But so by 1930, we'd already been looking at what?
50 years?
Yeah. So
of
we'd had 50 years
industrialization.
of erosion before that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the issues that I know we face here in Sudbury is the actually fallout from the mining and contamination into the soil. So do we know what the impact of that has been, as far as you mentioned this with things like nickel washing down to the North Channel? That's getting better, as I understand it.
In fact, as far as Junction Creek and the watershed is improved dramatically. Historically, 5 of the tributaries used to come from tailings, or what we refer to as the Badlands. It's carried down every time the acidity, the sulfur, and the heavy metals. And that
The tributaries actually started in the tailing ponds?
Some of them, yes.
Wow.
The tailing ponds leaked into the nearby tributaries, which carried
okay,
the
so
acidic
it
water and
leads
the
to
heavy metals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Till about 10 years ago, what was then Inco, which is now Vale, you know, one of the largest nickel and copper mines in the world. In fact, the smelter operation here is one of the largest in the world, so you can imagine how big we're talking about. Anyway, about 10 years ago, they stopped all of that leakage to all of the tributaries, just as we began. And Inco, actually, members of Inco, or what is now Vale, were part of our restoration committee. And this is, I'll lead to this shortly. So today, we've stopped that source of pollution. So the water quality entering Junction Creek is very good in some places. And we need to keep planting in some of the tributaries, the vegetation, to act as a buffer for those heavy metals, especially in the spring runoffs. or especially during the heavy rain, summer storms. And we are doing that. We need to continue to do that. It's not 100% yet. So we've stopped the source pretty well. What we now have to do is restore the habitat, which will in turn increase and encourage other life forms to return. We have reintroduced brook trout in some of the tributaries. We can't quite prove...
Do you want to tell me which ones?
Well,
and where the pools are?
Thomas, we hear from people who live nearby these tributaries that they see kids going to fish for brook trout. So we have this challenge of
shooting the kids,
of making these brook trout sustainable.
Yeah.
And I must tell you, there's an internal dispute amongst the committee. We're all volunteers. No, we're not allowed to shoot them. But some of us believe, it doesn't make sense that we should encourage fishing. When we're trying to encourage the fish population to increase, while others in the committee believe, and some of these are freshwater biologists, but the symbol of people actually fishing in Junction Creek again says so much. This hasn't been seen in decades, in generations. So we're torn between these two visions, but we like Junction Creek to be.
Yeah. We're talking today with Franco Mariotti from Science North, staff scientist there, and we're talking in particular about Junction Creek. One of the things that came to my mind, Franco, was a lot of the folks that listen to this podcast are students, and they might be interested in helping to restore some of their own environments in their own areas. Maybe talk a little bit about how the local schools maybe played a part in I think you said of the 11 years of restoring Junction Creek, if you would.
There's 65,000 students within a kilometer of Junction Creek.
Wow.
And keeping that in mind, we've tried to approach all of these schools and more to then take biological surveys of the creek. So literally from kindergarten, mostly up to grade 8 and occasional secondary students. In elementary level, we do these biological surveys where they actually get to see themselves what can be in the creek. So we take them to parts of the creek that are relatively healthy, and they search for aquatic invertebrates. And that's a treasure hunt. Kids find that exciting, right? Dragonfly nymphs and so on. With high schools, we've switched more to getting them involved to help clean the creek. So they do everything from literally picking up garbage, and to date we have surpassed 45 tons of garbage out of the creek, because it used to be called Junk Creek, including an entire vehicle, an entire car out of the creek, just to give you an idea. So that's some of the restoration work, and then sometimes the students also plant trees. We've now taken it to the stage where schools and community groups can adopt a section of the creek. This is not new. Environmental groups have done this across the world, whether it be a section of road or streams. We have over 12 kilometers of section that have been adopted by groups, Boy Scout schools, who once or twice a year go along and clean it.
Nice.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And so we've learned over the years that, it's not the committee that does the work. We guide the work. The best thing we can possibly do, and the lesson we've learned all these years, is subbarians need to do the work. So then, by empowering them, they begin to realize that Junction Creek is part of their home. And this is the most valuable lesson anybody can learn. When we started releasing brook trout, it wasn't the biologist who did it. We invited families, and the parents gave their few-year-old children, I've seen everything from 3-year-old holding a bag with 10 brook trout to high school students. Now think for a moment the value to this. You think it's a cute picture where they go to the creek and dump it in. When that child goes back to school and he sees a colleague, a friend, throw a pop bottle or a can or a chip bag in the creek, what do you think the child's going to respond? Hey, I put fish in there. You shouldn't do that. So we create ownership. And this is what I think the most positive thing that has happened is subbarians now are looking at the creek, beginning to look at it as a valuable natural asset. So the reversal from what was 12 years ago of Junk Creek, they're now seeing it as a natural asset that can improve not only the quality of life for the environment, but for themselves. One of the missions of the creek is to install a trail throughout the length. 11 kilometers has been built over the last 20 years. We are now pushing for the last 7 kilometers over a 4-year plan that we are actually going to City Council next week asking for money to finish that trail. Now, some of you may say, what does that have to do with restoration? Again, some of us have learned that if you provide access for people to experience the creek, they see for themselves the value. And you cannot overestimate that access. So by having a trail that people can walk, cycle, run, right through the heart of the city is amazing. And we're realizing that it also attracts tourists. And
fish.
Our ultimate vision, I'm glad Thomas says this, is, and this is not my vision, but a colleague who's a freshwater biologist says, his vision is a school boy walking off the Sudbury Transit bus with a fishing rod and going to fish on Junction Creek. This is the image we want the future of Sudburyans to promote.
Nice.
Well, it's certainly not the image that we've...
Sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
It's certainly not the image that Junction Creek has had until the group has come in. And I don't think there's anybody in Sudbury that doesn't know of Junction Creek and know of the issues. And as you say, one of the big things is educating the community and getting the community to buy into this restoration project. Colin, sorry? Oh, sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that, you talked about pulling that car out. Now I know where Thomas got his free car. But anyways, moving on from there. I noticed that you're raising some funds for a documentary about Junction Creek. Maybe talk about where that project's at.
It's all part of the education. The truth is, we've already raised it, and the documentary's done.
Wow.
A year and a half ago, we were very, how would I say, energetic about getting the word out about Junction Creek and what the possibilities of it are in as many ways as possible. We were thinking of inviting artists to do an art competition about painting Junction Creek in many ways as possible, but the idea, and then a book also, but the idea came up of a short film documentary, and we've seen this at film festivals, and we want to do a different thing though than just sort of be straightforward documentary. We wanted to combine humor, animation with a realistic story, and that's what we did. But we honestly thought it would take at least 5 or 6 years to raise the $150,000 we needed. It took a year. It's amazing. The coordinators, we've had, I think that's the right name, the coordinators who are paid position. No, it's not coordinator. What?
Directors?
Thank you. The director of Junction Creek, which is a paid position. Everything else are volunteers. So the board is a volunteer, the co-chairs of which I am is a volunteer, but the director is a paid position. And we've had 4 directors now over the 11 years. All of them have been passionate about what we've done. And all of them together have raised, get this, over $1 million towards Junction Creek in the past 11 years. Part of that money was towards this film. And so now we have given every school, or are in the process of giving every school in Sudbury a free copy of that film. That's where we're at right now. And every library too, I should say. And
will that film also be available on YouTube, or how could somebody outside of the Sudbury area get access to that, Franco?
If you go to junctioncreek.com, that should bring you to the film. One of the ways to get to the film.
Junctioncreek.com. Okay, excellent. We'll put that up in the show notes as well. I do want to give the last word on this topic to Thomas and Colin, so before I do, another question that I had is, I'm thinking about students that are out there that might have an idea for their own project on locally what they need to do to clean up a waterway or some environmental concern. What's the first step that you could advise them to take on a project like that? Who should they contact? Who should they talk to? Obviously, their bank accounts are going to be somewhat not up to the task, but
I guess that's one of the thoughts, is that you might have to start a project like this. You don't. The first thing that counts is choosing something you believe in. And I strongly advise that. If you're just looking for any project to get involved, I don't think that's going to go very far. But if you honestly believe in pursuing a specific vision, as a lot of the volunteers who are now involved with Junction Creek do, then you could go a long way. But the first thing is, get friends or people you know who are of the same belief. Then try to spread the word. If you're a student at school, go on an announcement to say, everybody's interested, I'll meet you this afternoon at 3:30. We're going to share this idea and see where we can go from here. And the money may come afterwards. You don't have to do it right now. The first thing is getting awareness, is starting to organize yourself. And the next thing would be organize yourself, so then you need to go visit the decision makers, the city councilors in this case. You really do need the decision makers on site at some point. And that's where the success of Junction Creek has come along. We have never turned to the city for money up until about 3 years ago. actually 4 years ago. Up to that point, we were very successful raising our own money, but doing the work, getting some parents involved. So they began to perceive us as a very positive movement. We didn't have to sell ourselves when we first went to council. And so what I suggest to students is show yourself what you believe in. Start talking to other students, other schools, people in your community about what you believe in, and share that. That is probably the most powerful thing. And then you'll be impressed at how many people will join the cause. So the fundraising is the last thing. Not everybody wants to spend time fundraising. I'm not a very good fundraiser, but there are other people in the group who do very well at that. So, when you gather these people together, some have their strengths and some have their weaknesses, and you put all of that together, it will work out. One last thing, though, we've made it our own personal mission that we never embarrass any of the polluters. If anything, we try to get them involved. The polluters have to be a part of the solution, have to be. And you don't do that by embarrassing them. So you don't go to the press, and point fingers. We've never wanted to do that. And with that, I think our group is highly respected in the community because we're not known as that. We're not out there to point fingers or embarrass anybody. But we're rather out there to educate everybody, look at the positive aspect, and get involved in this positive asset that we have. And so far, it's worked very well for us.
Super. Thank you for that answer. Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, that last part was really interesting. It's really a neat twist on it to see. I actually had a question, kind of a two-part question. And you mentioned you had particularly elementary kids going out, digging under rocks, looking for invertebrates and that sort of thing. What's the monitoring process? Do you have researchers monitoring? Because to me, it's a really good place to do some monitoring and then testing the results of what you're doing. So what's the monitoring process, and are the kids who are going out turning over rocks part of that process, and can they see following the inquiry as things change and as the health improves? Are students part of that whole thinking in scientific terms long term?
That's an excellent question, Colin. The first part of your question is, are we monitoring? Yes, but not us as volunteers. No. I've alluded to earlier that we try to get a lot of people from the community involved. One of the serious members are freshwater biologists from the Living with Lake Center here at Laurentian University.
Super.
They have provided students, biology students, who actually do serious biological surveys. Excellent. We were able to go to City Council because 2 surveys were done several years apart to answer, is all this work shown anything? Is it the creek actually improving? Because if you walk by it every day, it looks the same. So by having these serious biological surveys, we were able to show the differences over the years. And my gosh, what a difference. We were able to show that areas of the creek that had no life before now have several species of minnows. And areas that had a few species of minnows before have diversified, not only in more species, but in numbers. Right. And when we told that to council, you could hear the actual it was amazing. That's awesome. Exactly what you want to hear from them. So the answer to that is you have to do serious surveys to show if what you're doing works. Perfect. Second part of your question is, do these students get involved? No, we don't use the data. We actually collect the invertebrates and show them how neat some of these creatures are. And they learned that the presence of or lack of some of these creatures are health indicators for the environment, for that ecosystem. Sure. So they learn a lot. Not only that there's neat animals living there, but also, hey, you don't need to be a scientist to know whether you have a healthy creek or not. If this dragonfly nymph or a damselfly nymph is there, that's a pretty good sign. So it's mostly education for elementary students, but we do have serious scientific research involved. Yeah. It has to be an integral part of this.
Super. Thank you.
So, Thomas, last question goes to you, and then we must break for our sponsor spot.
Awesome. Franco, you've been doing this for 11 years. You've got a lot of changes that you've observed, that documented the studies. You've got a documentary now. Where's the Junction Creek group going from here? What's next?
There are still areas to restore. By the restore, I mean actually shoreline restoration, not only planting trees, but creating shelters for fish to actually use as habitat. That's the next steps. We're looking at storm sewers. There's a serious problem with storm sewers throughout the city where when it rains a lot, we get a lot of sediment coming in. We have to look at some of these and see if we could stop that and reduce that sediment from coming in. So we're working on that. Equally important is this finishing the trail to create an access to people throughout the entire range. And this year we're really, really focusing on that. But all of these are going on at the same time. And the school programs, we reach about 1,000 students every spring, and then another 1,000 in the fall. That is continuing in both languages, by the way. So all of those are sort of a four-headed spear front that we continue to do every year.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Franco. Thanks, guys.
Franco Mariotti is the staff scientist, or one of the staff scientists at Science North in Sudbury, Ontario. Franco, thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to talk about butterflies after the break. Will you stay with us and
Sure.
join in with the conversation? Thomas brought this to us, so I'll ask him to introduce it. But before we talk about the butterflies, I do want to mention our good friends at Mueller Systems. If you have some pictures and some documents out there, we really encourage you to check out MuellerSys.com/VRock. They are the makers and the assistants of helping you get all of your data and your material backed up safely and easily and securely over the internet. If you go to the website today at MuellerData.com/VRock, you will be able to try their product free for 90 days, and we thank them very much for their support. Okay, moving on with the next part of the show, we're going to be talking about the Nabokov butterfly theory, and I've probably butchered that pronunciation, so I'll ask my good friend Thomas Merri to introduce that news article, and Thomas, take it away.
And we're back. Yeah, sorry. Franco realized that he just missed the first half of his meeting already, and so he had to run out the door.
Oh, okay.
So it was nice of him to stay through the first half anyway. There was an article that popped up in the New York Times middle of last week, caught my eye, and then went back to the original publication. So Nabokov is an author, and known for Lolita and then a bunch of other novels that I can't think of the name of. But it is respected, is known as this phenomenal author. It ends up he was a phenomenal lepidopterist and worked at the Harvard Museum in there as a curator. But probably because he was a freaking literary genius, he didn't get a lot of credit necessarily from the other moth guys, because he's an author, he's not a moth guy. He had proposed this model to explain the diversity of a particular group of butterflies that he was particularly caught with. So he was really fascinated with this group of butterflies that's highly diverse, but subtly diverse. So the differences between one butterfly and the next are pretty subtle. And he had proposed, based on the butterflies that they were finding in South American tropics and throughout the Americas, and comparing those to butterflies that were found in the Old World, he'd proposed this model where butterflies were migrating across the Bering Strait. So there's a land bridge that connected what's now Siberia and Alaska. This is what Palin looks out at when she's shooting at people. And so he had proposed this model where the butterflies were coming across this land bridge and moving down into the Americas, and then there was a little bit of diversity that was happening there, but he was explaining this diversity in the Americas based on multiple trips across this land bridge. And the sort of conventional wisdom at the time was that he was a literary genius, but he didn't know anything about butterflies. And they were really discounting, and here's a guy that he's good enough at what he's doing as a lepidopterist to be a curator at Harvard Museum, but there really wasn't a lot of respect for this theory. So now, X number of decades later, we have really good molecular techniques where we can go in and compare the gene sequences of these butterflies here throughout the Americas with the gene sequences from across the rest of the globe. And you know what? he happened to be right. And it wasn't happened to be. He'd actually teased it apart and put the story together. And he was right all along. And the paper, so the little brief review that I sent you in the paper, or from the New York Times, was saying, Nabokov vindicated and da-da-da-da. But if you read the actual scientific article, he had it right in down to the minutia details. And, I'm sure there are pieces here and there that he missed. But the authors of the paper were really impressed with the subtleties that he did manage to catch. And he wasn't lucky. He was thorough. He was a very dedicated scientist who spent a lot of time looking at these small things, not put off by the fact that he wasn't supposed to be a real scientist because he was an author, and teased apart a really interesting theory using what techniques he had to his hands 50-something years ago, right? And now with modern molecular biology, we're able to prove that in fact he was correct. So it was a really neat story. Here's a guy that is an amateur by the sort of modern science or science of his day standards. But I think largely was discounted because he was so good at something else that people really couldn't believe he could be good at many different things, sort of the Federal Express of his day. And he was right. And, we've got the tools now to go back and test it. And some of this is really the best kind of, it's certainly the most fun kind of science. When I did my PhD, we were testing a theory in about the year 2000 that had been proposed 20-something years beforehand, but there were no techniques to test it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But by the late 90s, the techniques were there, and we were able to test it, and we found out, yep, these guys were right. And it's a really similar story here where he could propose this thing and really discount some other theories that were out there, and the modern techniques have backed him up. So if you get a chance, go to the webpage, look at the articles, look at the review from the Times, look at the original science paper. It's a neat study.
Okay, but here's the thing. These are butterflies, right? And this is the Bering Strait, right? The Bering Land Bridge. So it's cold up there most of the year. These are butterflies. They don't live long. We're talking thousands of years that this must have taken in order for the butterflies to have migrated across. That's absolutely incredible to me.
One of the really interesting things he found was that they were actually piggybacking on polar bears. And it was this movement of the polar bears across the land bridge. It's not true, actually. I'm making that up.
You're making that last part up.
One of the really interesting things that they were able to show was we know that the climate varies through time. And this bridge that connects Alaska and Siberia, it was a land bridge in a warmer period of climate than what we have now. And what he was able to show was that these different types of butterflies that were moving across that land bridge, the type of butterfly that was moving across reflected the climate at the time that they moved across. Okay, right? And that was one of the really interesting things that's come out of that. So it's an interesting story. It's good that you bring that up, and that we often think of the world that we have now as being the way that it is. Right, and if you stop and think about it, you'll acknowledge, okay, well, it's not. Right, well, these are really good examples of just how dynamic the world around us is, and this land bridge that we know has come into existence, and either the ocean levels move up and down, or that there's a certain amount of movement of the Earth, and these land bridges come up and the land bridges submerge. Climates get warmer and colder. Along with that, you have more water that's tied up in ice or less water that's tied up in ice. And so we get movement of animals through areas that now are inhospitable. There are not a lot of butterflies flying between Siberia and Alaska now, but 10,000 years ago, that was an option.
Yeah.
Colin, last word goes to you, all things butterfly related.
Excellent. Well, you know what? Well, the one thing that stuck out at me again, and there's a line in here by this Dr. Pierce, the Harvard biology professor, who was looking at this, and she states here, it was an amazing, bold hypothesis, and then I thought, oh my God, we could test this, right? Nabokov teased it apart through sort of older styles of natural history and looking at variations in physical differences in the butterflies. And he had a really good theory, and that's where he built it from through very careful observation. But there was no other way of verifying it. And like Thomas said, with the development of techniques, she realized that now through DNA analysis and how we do genetics analysis to then tease apart evolutionary history in a different way, she realized she could test it. So I just think it's another really neat example of the process of science, and how when you look at things from multiple points of view, you can sort of verify if one is true by looking at it from a bunch of different ways. So that was what really stuck out at me in terms of modern science compare with sort of 50 years ago science, but different tools to show the same thing, and that somebody realized, hey, geez, you know what? I have a way to test this now. So that was what was really cool to me. So yeah, I thought it was really, really interesting.
And let me just really quickly, I know we were pressed on time, but to reinforce what Colin's just said, there were two really important mental leaps here. The modern researcher realizing that we could test this, but Nabokov realizing with the information that he had to hand what that pattern of evolution was. And oftentimes we get caught up in the modern techniques, what can we do, what can't we do. Nabokov took the tools that he had at his disposal at that time and was able to tease apart exactly what has happened that we've been able to show so many years later using those molecular techniques. But you can do really good science without having to have those molecular techniques, and that's the molecular techniques that ended up validating what he had done. So there was the realization on the part of the researcher that, hey, we could test this, and there was the realization on the part of Nabokov that, hey, I think this is what's going on. One of the other really neat things in that paper was his comment that it would be interesting to go back in a Wellesian time machine and test to see whether these butterflies were moving across. I can tell you as a working scientist, it is very difficult to manage to get published an allusion to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. So that was as impressive as anything in that paper.
Well, the other lesson that I learned from this, and I think we could all learn this lesson, is that people are brilliant, and they're not just brilliant in one area. Nabokov, a brilliant author, doesn't mean that he's not brilliant in other disciplines, and we need to listen to people and not dismiss them just because they're not scientists. They do have something to contribute. Brilliant people are brilliant people regardless. So, anyways, that doesn't apply to any of us, but,
I was going to say, present company accepted.
Thomas, thanks a lot for bringing that article forward. That was very interesting, and we'll put the link up in the show notes as well. So, gentlemen, unless there's anything else, I think we're going to call the show today.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Super. Well, on behalf of Dr. Thomas Merri at Laurentian University and Colin Jagoe at the Pine Ridge District School Board, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great week.
Thanks guys.